Ready to go? Phil? Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our community rollout of Tullahoma's Think Tullahoma 2040. You know about the plan. You've seen it in being put together for the last several months. We've had over 1,100 inputs from citizens of the community, so it's not city government's plan. It's not Phil Walker's plan. It's your plan, because you've put your thumbprint on this plan very well, and here tonight you're going to see that. So at this time, we want to get this ball rolling. If we start on time, maybe we can finish on time. Ending time, Phil, is 7:30, so keep tabs on that. So welcome to Think Tullahoma 2040. Phil Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. All right, it's good to be back. You know, the last time we were here, we talked a really long time. I think we wore people out. So we've actually tried to use a little bit of self-discipline this time and allot certain time limits for each of us presenting. So hopefully we can be at least in the ballpark. But oh, next slide, please. I'm not going to do a whole lot of background, because I know a lot of you that are here have already been to a lot of these meetings, but I'm sure there's somebody new, so just to give you the minimal amount. So I'm Phil Walker, I'm the project manager. We've also got Keith Covington, who is a architect, urban designer, and planner, and we've got Liesl Gothert, who is a planner with a big focus on transportation, and she is a Tullahoma native, born and raised. And last but not least, we got Randy Gross. Randy, you want to raise your hand? Thank you. Randy is an economist and strategic planner. I don't know if you can see the full list of the steering committee, the volunteer steering committee members, but any of you who are here, do you mind raising your hand just so you can, oh, great, thank you. And they're really invaluable to all this and, you know, getting their input. And of course there's staff, you know, Jennifer Moody and Winston and Mary are around here somewhere. So anyway, that's kind of who's who. Next slide, please. And the only thing I want to really hit on with the background is just to emphasize, particularly if somebody hasn't been at one of these meetings yet, is that there have been a lot of meetings. So back in July was our first kickoff meeting. In late August, we had this series of stakeholder group meetings with different groups that have a particular focus on something related to the community. We also had these, what we called quadrant meetings. You know, your town is laid out very nicely to create these quadrants. So, and there's an elementary school in at least one in each quadrant. So we had a series of meetings there. Next slide, please. We also, as was mentioned, the public opinion survey, we ended up getting over 1,000 responses. Now, for a town of roughly 20,000 people, that is really good. So that was very useful. Next slide, please. And if you might remember the last time we were here, I think it was late fall, we did this 5-day charrette, which kicked off the first evening with the public workshop at the high school cafeteria, where people broke up into teams and they all came up with their own ideas and presented their plans at the end of the evening. So there's been a lot of really helpful input so far. With that said, if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to bring Keith up here, and he's going to talk about place types.
Thanks, Phil. It's great to be back here. So one of the key components of your comprehensive plan that's going to guide future development in the area is the place types map. And the place types map is very different from the more traditional or conventional future land use map that you see in communities because it really gets at the essence of the form of development as well as land use. So in other words, if you see the images on the top and bottom on your right, you know, both of those might be red on a traditional future land use map, but downtown is very different from Jackson. And so place types recognize that. So what determines a place type? Obviously land use is still important. Spatial patterns though, intensity, density, the scale of development, how tall or where the building is placed on the site, the form and character development all comes into place type determination. And then there are 5 basic place type categories: natural, rural, suburban, urban, and special. And within each of those categories, there are several subcategories for your community, because obviously it's not a one-size-fits-all. And then some of you may ask, how do these get implemented? Because this is policy, this is guiding policy. Zoning and development regulations are actually what actually implement place types. This is not zoning, this is just policy. Next slide, please. Oh, I went backwards, I think. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I'm losing my time. Okay, all right. So just as a quick overview of these different place types, this is a kind of a generic graphic at the top that sort of illustrates these different places. Natural, as you might imagine, are streams, floodways, floodplains, wetlands, steep slope areas that generally you want to stay away from in terms of development. Then you have the rural areas of your community, which are open fields, wooded areas. Development is low density, but it could still feature a wide range of uses, but particularly you see agriculture in these areas. Then you have your suburban areas. They're low to moderate intensity, but they're generally segregated. Your commercials here, your residential's here, your institutional's here, and that forces a community design that is really automobile oriented. Then as you move into your more intense areas, your urban areas, they're moderate to higher density, but they're mixed in their use. And they're not only mixed in their use, they're mixed in their development, in the sense that it's usually a interconnected network of streets and blocks, and they accommodate more than just automobiles. They're really focused on pedestrians and bicyclists and other modes of transportation. And then there's that category that doesn't really where certain things just don't fit in a particular one of those other categories, and we call that special. These are typically focused on a single use or function, and example of that would be kind of an institutional campus or an industrial park or so forth, and you have that. So next slide, please. So on the overview, you can see that under those 5 basic categories that I described, you have, I think it's somewhere around 17 or 18 subcategories of there, and this is that place types map. And I'm just going to kind of go through these generally so that you get an idea of what that means. Next slide. Oh, okay. So first of all, your natural place types, these are located throughout the city, but they're primarily along creeks and so forth. And, they're, undeveloped areas for the most part, or outdoor passive recreation and greenways. And really, there's really no development in these areas, or it's very light development. Next slide. So here you can see some images, some precedent imagery of what a natural area might contain. You can see mostly things that are left intact, but also some passive recreation in the scope of trails. Next slide, please. And then your rural place types, these are only located in your urban growth boundary areas, which are controlled by the counties. And the primary land uses there, like I said earlier, were, our undeveloped open space, agricultural uses, and some low density single family residential. And the form is primarily houses and outbuildings associated with that, but the lots are larger. Usually you have a minimum of 3 acres of lots, and the setbacks are much deeper than what you see in some of the other areas. Next slide. And this is some precedent imagery of the rural areas. Next slide. So in the suburban areas, these are throughout the city. Actually, there's a lot of these areas within the community. They probably take up the most land area, but that's understandable because they're the kind of less intense areas. The primary land uses really depend on the areas. Remember I said they're kind of segregated in their uses, so there's some commercial, there's some residential and so forth, but especially on your corridors is where a lot of your commercial uses are. And again, this is low to moderate density uses and more of an auto-oriented design. And by auto-oriented means that you kind of have to use your car. You're kind of forced to use your car to get between a lot of these areas. It's less walkable. Next slide. And here's a few images of what this is. You can see the varying degree of land uses, whether it's a single family subdivision. This is where you might see an apartment sort of complex as opposed to apartments fit within a neighborhood. You still see single family residential, and then of course commercial shopping centers and so forth. Next slide. So on the urban place types, these are primarily in the core of your community and to some areas on the periphery based on location, whether they're adjacent to schools and other development and so forth. And in these urban place types, again, it's kind of based on the particular subcategory, but you find a mixture of uses, primarily residential, but also commercial and institutional uses, particularly in your downtown and so forth. So these are your highest intensity areas, but they feature a very pedestrian-friendly design, so they're very much in line with sort of the historic patterns of your downtowns. So next slide. You can see some images there. This is the top two images obviously are downtown Tullahoma, but also the bottom two images are actually new developments that are designed in that same pattern as many of your historic neighborhoods. Next slide. Special place types. So this is that last one, that sort of catch-all for these sort of other areas. They're scattered, but they're primarily in the northwest and southeast. And again, the primary land use really depends on the specific type: industrial, institutional, recreational, obviously aviation. And the development form is really about trying to create, at least in terms of new development in these areas, more of a campus-like feature. So next slide, you can see some imagery of what that looks like. All right, jumping on, you go to the next slide. Community design, just a few more slides here and I'll turn it over. So community design, something that we heard a lot about during the charrette and even before that was, Jackson Street. And remember what I said about Jackson Street, it has different characters depending on where you are in there. So some of the current challenges: gaps in the sidewalk system, lack of street trees, front parking lots that are very barren. It's difficult to cross. There are large signs and billboards, lots of driveways, and really limited cross access, which forces you to go back out on Jackson to even maybe go to the shop or development next door. In 2019, you did a streetscape plan that was really limited on the right-of-way, but it did have a lot of good recommendations in terms of improving mobility, in terms of sidewalks, pathways, street trees, and trying to clean that up a little bit. Next slide. So what we did was we took a look at two different segments of North Jackson and did some scenarios on how future development should really conform to a better vision. So within the right-of-way, obviously in your urban segment, this is the urban segment from downtown to Wilson. Within the right-of-way, continuous sidewalks and pathways are really important. Street trees are important to make that a more pleasant experience for pedestrians. Enhanced street crossings, and then fewer and narrower driveways so that you encourage more pedestrian activity in these areas. Beyond the right-of-way, though, this is where we go beyond what the streetscape plan did in 2019. What you're trying to do is to get buildings closer to the street. Perhaps they're not as close as they are to downtown, but you're creating a significant or creating a consistent street wall. Parking is located behind buildings. Landscaping is included in parking lots to address when it's visible from the street, to kind of screen it. You have smaller signs and so forth, and no new billboards. And then you have cross access between sites so that you don't necessarily have to get back out on Jackson to do that. And so that's very important. And this is just an example of some of those characteristics in a typical section. And if you'll go to the next slide. In the suburban section, a lot of the proposed improvements are very similar to the urban development, but in the more suburban section, and this is really farther north of downtown, where you have larger footprint buildings and so forth, and maybe a higher parking demand based on location and proximity to residential, you might have limited parking up in front. But again, you want to strive to create a more consistent streetscape pattern as opposed to the sort of hodgepodge pattern of development now as these properties redevelop in the future. And then lastly, if you'll go to the next slide, we also took a look at new downtown housing, and not just housing, but the idea of mixed use in these areas. We took the site right across from the new police station, which is vacant right now and kind of sits up high and overlooks the floodplain that is down near Rock Creek and so forth, and showed how you could redevelop that site with housing and mixed use that would actually would fit in really well with downtown. If you go to the next slide, you can see an image there of that. So you're kind of standing up there and you're looking down into the park, and Phil will talk more about that. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Liesl.
Awesome, thanks Keith, appreciate that. So kind of on the flip side of the coin to what Keith just mentioned in terms of place types, land use, urban form, character, the flip side of the coin to that is roadway and street types. So like Keith mentioned, previously, traditionally, land use and transportation are kind of were considered separate. There's really been a concerted effort to kind of bridge those silos and marry those concepts together because, yeah. Oh, so sorry. Yeah, okay, thank you. We're so good though. So, therefore, there are roadway and street types that have been identified. And basically the goal of these, the purpose of these to include in the plan is so that you really provide the right street in the right place. For Tullahoma, there have been 8 that have been identified. If you were to overlay this map with Keith's map, you would be able to identify some of the commonalities between what he was talking about in terms of walkability, bikeability, those types of elements. So the purpose for having these is really to provide guidance for city staff as new roadways are developed or constructed, or existing roadways are improved. Doesn't mean, we're going to start off here with the rural parkway, doesn't mean that that's necessarily what every rural parkway in Tullahoma should look like. Instead, it's more of provides guidance in terms of how wide is the right-of-way, what type of elements, what type of streetscaping are you looking for, drainage, shoulders, is it a shoulder, is it curb and gutter, travel lanes, medians, those types of elements. It also provides kind of general guidance on the width of those elements. So a good example for a rural parkway here in Tullahoma is the New Manchester Highway SR 55 kind of out towards Rose Hill Cemetery, if you think about that. So obviously there's a lot different contexts out there, higher speeds, higher volumes, and so you see the elements within the right-of-way reflect those user needs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Did it go? What was that? Oh, there we go. Okay. Rural suburban road, sorry. So this is an example. You can think of these roadways as being a Ledford Mill road example. So your corridors that are leading out kind of near the edges of the city limits. These are the type of elements that you would expect in the roadway right-of-way for bicycle and pedestrians. You would typically see a side path versus having sidewalks and bike lanes. This is just given the speeds, particularly, of the vehicles out there, but you also want to provide that planning strip to kind of create that buffer between areas where you may have a side path going along the roadway. Next slide, please. Suburban Avenue. A good example of that is East Carroll Street, so kind of out there by Gondola. The context changes there as well as the user needs. It's the same, or largely the same, volumes of traffic as it is that rural parkway. However, you can see here there's the opportunity for a center turn lane, and that's to provide that safe access. One of the biggest crash types here in Tullahoma are rear-end crashes, and so providing that safe center turn lane provides great access and a safer environment for those facilities. Next slide. All right, Suburban Street. Let's see what's going here. Okay, so a good example of this one is West Side Drive. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the suburban streets will have these elements, but again, it's showing you the types of facilities and widths that you would want to see for generally these types of roadways to provide safe walking opportunities, biking opportunities, where you expect that type of user demand. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a new cross-section for new roadways. So when new subdivisions come online, this is kind of a basic design guideline for those roadways. So you want to see kind of a narrower travel lane to keep those speeds slower for vehicles, curb and gutter to get the stormwater safely off the roadways, planting strips with sidewalks on both sides. Next slide. Urban Avenue, this specifically is for Jackson Street within the downtown core. I think it's important to note that the state highway system is ultimately, the design is decided by TDOT, so there's certainly kind of a dance that goes on between local interest as well as TDOT's interest, which is to move traffic across between cities and regionally and of course statewide. But you can kind of see here where ideally you want to have some narrower travel lanes. The speed limit drops there. It's also where you have folks kind of accessing the local restaurants, other local businesses. So you want traffic moving slower. You're going to have some on-street parking. Not all portions of South Jackson have the available right-of-way. The right-of-way fluctuates down there. But where you can, you want to have on-street parking. It does provide a little bit of a traffic calming. And of course, you want to have wide sidewalks to accompany folks that are moving around, folks in wheelchairs that, again, are going to the restaurants and stores. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of an urban street. Like I mentioned, these cross-sections, just because what you see is not necessarily what's being recommended for all the urban streets. The one I have here shown is for West Lincoln, so outside of London's, for example, where you have a much wider right-of-way. You can provide angled parking for those restaurants and businesses. You also want to see some landscaping, street trees. The way you accomplish that is through the furnishing zones, preferably with tree wells, to accomplish those landscaping goals. And then again, you're still going to have your wide sidewalks. The sidewalks will narrow as you get out of the downtown core, so as you're going out towards the Celtic Cup, you're not going to expect as many folks to be walking around, so a 6-foot sidewalk is definitely capable of accommodating those folks walking and biking. Okay, next slide, please. So in a similar manner, just like there was a local suburban street for new development, this is also a local urban street for new development. Again, you want to see narrow lanes. You're going to incorporate on-street parking in this context, as well as with landscaping and sidewalks on both sides, excuse me. Next slide, please. Okay, so in general, roadways and connections for the general improvements, this builds off of, Tullahoma actually completed a comprehensive transportation plan, which did a much more in-depth analysis back in 2013. And then Tullahoma also had a mobility study done in 2019, which also included public engagement and identified sidewalks and bikeway connections. So building off of those plans, as well as incorporating the input that we heard from the public and stakeholders, we came up with, these are kind of the ones that floated to the top of the list, particularly being Cedar Lane, probably no shocker there. Tullahoma was successful in receiving a TDOT grant to look at that corridor more in depth and kind of identify construction challenges for a potential lane widening, addition of a center turn lane, again, to provide keep the operations of vehicles flowing while folks are trying to turn into the apartments there, and also considering more of a complete street with sidewalks to give those folks access to the important grocery stores and nearby businesses. The other ones that kind of floated to the top were William Northern Boulevard. So this is in front of the new senior independent housing, that area. Basically eliminating, we heard, to potentially, okay, that was my note, to potentially eliminate one of those wishbones, as well as to add sidewalks to complete to that new connection so that folks can walk to Publix and kind of that area of Jackson. Wilson Avenue, Avoca, we heard about a need for potentially having an additional crossing that is not at grade, because we hear about folks getting stopped by the train. So that's just a potential. It's basically, it would extend potentially again off of Wilson to Avoca, but that is something that would need a much more in-depth feasibility study. There's obviously a lot of challenges there and would be very costly. So that would need to go under further study there. Anderson Street, finally, was another one that I know Tullahoma has actively been going after grants to kind of brighten up that corridor and bring those sidewalks up to grade. Next slide, please. In terms of intersection improvements, you can see them listed on the screen. These are ones that we heard about as well as observed and saw issues, from a desktop review in terms of potentially needing to study these intersections a little bit more. There's a little bit of a queue issue at some of these intersections during peak hour. So studying those and seeing if maybe potential signals need to be added or upgraded is what those are speaking to. Next slide, please. Shoulder improvements, these are largely for vehicular safety. Not that it's should be an acceptable facility, but it can also provide space to walk and bike on these roadways that have been identified that have very narrow pavement widths. So you can see those listed on the screen. Finally, next slide, increased connectivity. Certainly heard that from an economic development perspective for connectivity, increased connectivity to I-24. We also heard a lot about increased connectivity in and around Tullahoma, so kind of taking in what we heard in terms of sustainability, the health of the downtown, some of the fiscal challenges that the city has. We really felt like emphasizing, again, those intersection improvements and major corridors, improving those and utilizing what you've already invested in your roadway network is certainly fruitful. Next slide, please. Getting close to done here. All right, and these are kind of general design, almost design principles for the roads and streets. Cul-de-sacs, generally those are, from a transportation perspective, are frowned upon. You really want to see more increased street connectivity, disperses your traffic so you're not having so many issues during peak hour, for example, at those intersections. Driveways, you want to minimize the number of those, particularly along South and North Jackson. Those create conflict points and reduce the operational functionality of those roadways. So those are just a couple examples from there. All right, next slide, please. I just have two more. Bicycle mobility. Like I mentioned, we built off of that 2019 plan. So we incorporated about 8 to 9 additional lane miles of bicycle facility, and that is to support the investments and ideas for new growth areas, parks, museums, those types of things. We incorporated that input to identify those additional connections. Next slide, please. Pedestrian connectivity, again, same deal, built off of that 2019 plan, really emphasizing connectivity between the parks, schools, and as well as other destinations. Some of the major sidewalk priorities, as you all I'm sure are aware, Cedar Lane, Avoca Road is another important one for kids to walk to school over by Robert E. Lee. And then some of the Greenway priorities particularly is extending that Rock Creek Greenway all the way to Kroger to Cedar Lane, basically fill that gap, would provide a great alternative to the Cedar Lane corridor for those walking and biking to access important commercial and job resources. Okay, I think that was it. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Okay, natural resources is basically two things I want to talk about: water resources and trees. And water resources, whether it's wetlands, floodplains, whatever, are really important environmentally. They're also a development hazard. And I'm just going to hit on key points really with this next batch of slides just to keep us on pace. But limiting the amount of disturbance of floodplains is something we're recommending. Potentially using transfer development rights where you shift density away from areas you're trying to protect to other areas that can accommodate more growth. And then looking at some potential incentives for protecting water resources as far as property tax or fee reductions. Next slide, please. With regard to trees, again, just like water resources, they're important to the environment for a lot of different reasons. We're recommending that you require street trees for subdivisions and also consider a tree preservation ordinance where, there would be an inventory of trees of a certain size, before development occurs, and look for ways to save them or at least replace them. Also, I'm going to mention now, because we don't have a section on resiliency, we have it in the plan, a brief section, but and some of these ideas are repeated in that, in addition to other ideas dealing with climate change and the need for resiliency. But we are recommending that a separate resiliency plan be considered. Next slide, please. With regard to cultural resources, we're talking only about historic buildings. And you know, there's a big difference between National Register districts and local historic districts, because local districts actually have protections for buildings, which National Register does not. It does come with financial incentives, but not protections. So we're suggesting that the community explore the idea of local historic districts. And this is a map that was put together some years ago. I think these areas are actually larger than they probably would be warranted, but it's one of those things that if there's sufficient property owner support, I think it's worth pursuing. And also, we recommend that you do design guidelines, even if you don't designate local districts, simply because they can be a great resource for information, and also you can incentivize them. Next slide, please. Parks and recreation. So, you know, there's a bunch of improvements that are already in the works. I won't go over those. What we have recommended are some new facilities like basketball courts, pickleball courts. Of course, that's kind of a fairly new phenomenon for me, but we're starting to see it in communities all over the place. A dog park, and you already have one dog park, but for a community your size, a lot of communities your size have 2 dog parks. A skate park is needed, and then parking and restrooms at Short Springs. We also recommend that you have a park and recreation master plan prepared that can go beyond what we're doing with this plan, especially if you want to have success getting grants for parks and recreation. Next slide, please. And I think Keith touched on this a little bit. You know, we're recommending a park for Rock Creek, and you can kind of see it would be Grundy up to beyond Wilson Avenue could be the area. It's all floodplain. You know, as Liesl was mentioning about the greenways, a greenway would go along here. This is an idea that was actually brought to us by private citizens, and it would be more of a passive park, not a bunch of recreational activities. Next slide, please. And the last thing I want to touch on right now is downtown. And, you know, there's been a big focus on downtown. So many people realize that it's sort of a, you know, downtown's a gauge for the success of your community and reflects a lot. And what we're suggesting is that you adopt a Main Street program or a similar program, even if it's not formally part of the Main Street program. You've already started efforts in 2018, and we just need to kind of kick that in the driveway more. And recommendations include funding. You know, we're proposing $125,000 to $150,000 budget annually. Most of that money would probably come from the city. That's just how most Main Street type programs are funded. And you would set up a 501c3 and, you know, board of directors, a Main Street manager, and all that kind of stuff. Next slide, please. With regard to design, and we organize our recommendations, by the way, for downtown based on the Main Street 4-point approach, which is organization, design, economic vitality, and promotion. And with regard to design, I already talked about the potential for historic zoning. And, you know, I think the real goal here, a lot of your older buildings have been altered over the years. So the real objective is to see if you can bring them back closer to what they would have looked like historically. Like I said, adopt design guidelines even if you don't have a local district. When it comes to streetscape, the area around Lincoln and Atlantic, which is your probably most recent streetscape downtown, is a good model to stick with. And with regard to parking, the first thing you need to do is manage on-street parking. That doesn't mean you have to have parking meters, but you need to regulate it for turnover, maybe 2-3 hour parking, and particularly getting downtown employees to not park in that prime parking where you want customers who are going to spend money downtown to park. We also think you can get on-street parking on Jackson Street. We've got a design for that, and you can create some more off-street parking lots. Next slide, please. We've also proposed a new park. If you look at this map, you can see this is primarily where Traders Bank is right now. It's at the corner of Grundy and Jackson, and the idea would be to have this lawn that's an amphitheater with movable seating. In the corner, you can see the stage, which would also have concessions and public restrooms. And by the way, the public restrooms could be open year-round, which is a huge amenity for your downtown. You could have a farmer's market. If you can see up there adjacent to Wall Street, which is essentially an alley, you could do a farmer's market there. We're showing tents. And then if you retain London's current parking, you might be able to bring food trucks in for special events. If you go to the next slide, please. So here's what it could look like. And then let me show you one other scenario. Next slide, please. This is the exact same approach, but if the London's parking area could be redeveloped, and as we said, other parking could be created elsewhere, you could actually put some retail buildings in, one-story retail where we were showing the food trucks before. If you go to the next slide, there's an illustration of that. So that's the exact same rendering, except that the food trucks are gone and the retail's in that foreground. Next slide, please. On economic vitality, land uses are a key part of that, you know, allowing housing to have ground floor, to allow ground floor housing on streets that aren't shopping streets. A meeting venue, and Randy did a market study on the prospects of a meeting venue. Oftentimes lodging is part of something like that, but even though a market analysis would need to be conducted to determine is there sufficient market demand for lodging. And then we recommended a brewery or distillery to kind of play off the distillery history. With business development, it's important to do a retail market analysis to figure out what's the optimal tenant mix, do a building inventory to figure out where those types of businesses could go, and then put together recruitment materials, a recruitment team, and then start going out and doing business recruitment. And then financial tools, I'm not going to get into that right now. Randy's going to touch on some of those, but for downtown specifically, tax increment financing and a business improvement district might have potential. Next slide, please. And then finally, on promotion, you know, this is something that the city has a major role in, you know, there with Parks and Recreation. So, you know, more events, if you have that public space that we're recommending, that would help with that. Digital media, like a website and social media that the Main Street program would head up. And then just some other strategies like shop local campaigns and encouraging and regulating food trucks. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Randy. Whoa. What an entry.
I'm alive, don't worry. There's a lot of information here, so I won't take up too much of your time, but as an economic consultant, I did a housing market analysis and also prepared some recommendations for economic development. As you can see, there were some concepts that came out of the housing market analysis related to downtown mixed-use development, based again on the market study, and neighborhood infill types of projects. So 50 to 200 units, which the market could support over the next 5 to 7 years in terms of neighborhood infill. There were also, if we could go to the next slide, and I can find the arrow. Can't see it. Oh, okay. Demand for apartment communities, both market rate and workforce housing that could be located in your commercial corridors, for example, and support young professionals, singles, students, and others in need of workforce housing locally. And then traditional neighborhoods with 150 or so units of for-sale housing with a mix of market rate, single family, and townhouses. So there are various types of concepts that came out of the market study. Then there are ways to leverage that type of development, such as through identifying and facilitating the creation of specific potential development sites in collaboration with different private property owners, creating marketing tours for regional brokers and developers to help market those sites, and then identifying and facilitating site development for apartment communities and conducting outreach to potential developers of those. And then finally, there's funding and leveraging opportunities for housing, such as by providing master planning assistance or technical assistance to provide assistance to developers or property owners to help get those sites developed, fast tracking of certain sites that have been pre-approved for development, creating infrastructure to help leverage development, et cetera, and also like a pilot program, which are fairly common throughout the state for redevelopment of key states, or a tax increment financing district that would include downtown and some of the corridors to promote inclusion, for example, of workforce units or to leverage the type of development that you'd like to see. And then finally, recreation amenities to serve residents and to act as anchors for new development. Also in terms of economic development, we looked at some of your existing sort of target industries and what we could do to refine sort of what you're doing now. One of those areas is health services and biomedical industries, which you have some competitive advantages for, You already have a medical center here. So really looking at how you can grow those in terms of the types of not only the labor force that you have and the skills that you have, but also new types of businesses that you can recruit to help build your healthcare hub here. And then there's obviously the aviation and aerospace industries and associated technology development with AEDC as your anchor, and the various contractors. Obviously you have University of Tennessee Space Institute and the airport. But there are opportunities here to create a technology park with certain specializations in aviation and aerospace, testing and environmental research, creating an innovation hub, and looking at the Space Institute as an anchor use there. So there is a need to really conduct a feasibility study to determine whether it's viable as a concept or not to help create those kinds of jobs and investment in the community. There's also the tourism component. You're obviously at the very center of Tennessee's whiskey region, and so there's opportunities to create more hubs here for the whiskey tourism. Then there's the aviation heritage. You already have the Beechcraft Heritage Museum, but perhaps building on that through a specialized library that could build on aviation heritage. And then recreation amenities, which you have some to begin with, but looking at ways to expand on those. One of the key issues that came up in our discussions, our strategic discussions on economic development, was really looking at some of your existing buildings and sites and improving some of those. So there needs to be an inventory and a conditions assessment of your existing buildings and sites, developing marketing programs around those specific sites, and creating incentives for redevelopment and rehabilitation of those sites within certain districts. For example, creating that downtown tax increment financing district, which utilizes the growth in taxes to support redevelopment within that specific area. So there are various ways of looking at that as well. And then finally looking at your marketing and recruitment for economic development in terms of specifically your structure, meaning your the type of government agency that you already have for economic development, identifying the target actions and achievements, but also having specific metrics and benchmarking in terms of your fiscal returns from different types of investments or economic development, revitalization of those buildings and sites, and looking at employment opportunities and diversification of your housing stock. So those might be ways to benchmark your achievements in economic development. And making sure that you have oversight over all of that in terms of what the council is watching and making sure that you're achieving. Also formalizing your marketing committee that you already have and having a unified, consistent messaging and branding for economic development throughout the area. And finally, again, using housing as a way to leverage economic development. And by looking at your local school system, which is a very impressive, highly rated school system, and making sure that you're including that in your marketing. So with that, we'll go on to implementation.
Okay. Thanks, Randy. Last thing we're going to talk about, implementation. Certainly not the least important, but it is at the end here. We're recommending that you put together an implementation committee. You've already had a steering committee, for the planning part of it, and having something similar for implementation, meeting periodically, assigning, city staff to it, and presenting to BOMA at least annually, if not twice a year, for an update on how implementation is going. Just some examples of the types of kind of categories of implementation that things we've already talked about. The policy revisions would include things like the zoning ordinance. Keith talked about the different place types with, that can translate into zoning. Similarly, Liesl talked about the road and street types. Those could become standards. Other policy changes could be things like the tree ordinance or requiring trees in subdivisions, dealing with on-street parking, regulation, that sort of thing. Capital improvements programs, that's spending money on projects like the parks. We talked about the downtown park, or just park upgrades throughout the community, stormwater improvements, those sorts of things, transportation. Next slide, please. And I know you can't read this, but just to give you an idea, we have this 2-page plan matrix, and the way it's organized, it's grouped by topic category, like place types at the beginning, if you can see that, mobility and corridors. Each key recommendation, it has a 1-sentence summary with an alphanumeric designation so you can reference it easy. There are page number references back in back in the plan. So if you want to read more about one particular recommendation, you go back and you can read the details. We say who the responsible parties are, and with the comprehensive plan, oftentimes the city is responsible for a lot, but it's not just the city. Sometimes it's the county, DOT, it could be your Main Street group once you get that going, and then a time frame. And then the last slide, or next to last slide, just some other issues that we address in this section. Annexation, we recommend that the city continue to pursue, as they've already done in the past, working with the counties to see if you can get zoning authority within the urban growth boundaries. Those are those beige areas to the north and south of town. And of course, Keith talked about designating those areas if we could have zoning control as rural place types. It's also important when you implement the plan to remain flexible because, there are certain circumstances that we can't foresee and you have to be able to adapt to it. But the key is that you still follow the planning principles. I didn't go over those in this presentation, but they are in the plan. And I think that's the key thing, to stick to the principles, even if some of the recommendations have to be adjusted. And then finally, you really should update your plan roughly every 5 years. So last slide, and I think it's Q&A time. So I know it's a lot to throw at you, and we did try to make it as concise as we could. If you've actually read the full plan, there's a whole lot more detail. There are things we couldn't even touch on. But anyway, that's just and we didn't go significantly over, so I'm kind of proud of us on that. So anyway, it's hard to see people out there, but questions, comments, we'd welcome those. Yes, sir.
So if a city wants to create more apartment buildings, for example, how do they encourage the developers to create apartment complexes, basically?
Right, so we have a whole section on that. I'm going to give that to Randy. He's here the housing part.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. So there was one slide on that actually, but part of that is really looking at how to facilitate that type of development by working with private property owners to identify specific sites and developing incentives that will help leverage that. So for example, if it's within the downtown area or nearby, you might have tax increment financing that can help leverage some of the infrastructure to support it. And I don't know if you're familiar with tax increment financing. It's fairly common in Tennessee, but it basically says that the property owners in this one area pay a specific amount of property taxes now, but once you develop it, obviously the taxes go up because now there's more buildings there to pay taxes on. So that increment or that change in taxes is captured for a certain period of time in bonds to pay for infrastructure, roads, or improvements in that area. So that would be an example. So using the city's powers to incentivize that would be a way to leverage development. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Randy. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Right, so the question, if you didn't hear, was whether there was any kind of like list of priorities based on things we were hearing over and over again. And, I would really say that the whole plan's a reflection of things, things that we were hearing a lot kind of percolate to the top, like, what is it, Cedar Lane? I mean, that was on everybody's list. And so, we paid a lot of attention to Cedar Lane. So, really, I would just say the whole plan reflects what we perceive, at least, to be the priorities. And one other thing, I failed to mention this before, maybe I mentioned it, but, based on the input we get tonight, we'll still do another set of revisions. So it's not as if this is the final plan and now you got to live with it. The whole idea is that we had it out there for people to be able to, review carefully and then get your input tonight, and we can make revisions. So if there's anything that we didn't address that you think needs to be addressed, we certainly can entertain that. Oh, I'm sorry. And what was the question about implementation? Oh, like a timing? Mm-hmm. Right, and so the way we did it, it wasn't so much about priority, but, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, she was just saying that there are certain issues that she feels should really go to the top of the list as priorities, like, you know, crossing Jackson, you know, crosswalks and signalization and that sort of thing, just as an example. And if you remember, I know you couldn't see it well, that matrix that I had at the very second to the last slide, that's where we take all the key ideas and we put them more within a time frame as opposed to priorities. And so we broke it up into things. We looked at this sort of over 5 years. Not that the whole plan is going to get implemented in 5 years, but we looked at kind of a 5-year horizon where there were year 1 items to be implemented, year 2 and 3, and then year 4 and 5. And what we tend to do is the things that are in year 1 are kind of what we would call the low-hanging fruit, things that aren't necessarily real expensive or real tough to do. I mean, great example is zoning changes, things like that. I mean, that's something that's pretty, you know, fairly easy to do. Adopting financial incentives, things like that, marketing. So there are a lot of things in year 1 that are less expensive. Now, when you're talking about these big, you know, I talked about capital improvements, these major, you know, some of the things Liesl was talking about with roads and so forth, you know, that might be off a little bit further. But there is a hierarchy on the time frame for implementation.
So I know the conversation was had. I did not hear much about it tonight as connecting downtown with maybe the rest of downtown. Like, this area of downtown is full, and between here and 2 blocks to get to Lincoln Street, full of history of Tullahoma and a lot to offer, and trying to connect the downtown area with the original town square and this area. Didn't hear much about that, and I do think that if that connectivity can happen, solves some of the issues with trying to create new entertainment venues downtown when you already have them downtown, but we're just not connecting the two corridors.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you're talking specifically about where we are now versus, you know, how do you connect it with downtown? Is that right? Okay. And I can't remember, Liesl, if we had anything specifically in the plan about that. I mean, we talk about connectivity throughout the community, but as far as that particular issue, we didn't really get into that. There is an existing sidewalk network, and that's kind of, you know, that's obviously important. If you didn't have those, I'm sure we would have said, oh, by the way, you need sidewalks, but at least you do have a sidewalk system, so, okay. Anybody else? Do we wear you out? Okay. Well, I tell you what, we will we'll hang around here, and got another one? Okay, good.
Hi, I haven't heard anything about the railroad that runs right through the middle of town that really kind of defines Tullahoma in my mind. You know, the impact that it has on housing developments right next to the railroad when they hold the horn as they come through into town. The fact that they have right-of-way that we could use, potentially partner with CSX or whoever else is running the railroads. So I was wondering, is there something that I've missed in the plan that has kind of touched on the topic of the rail line that runs through town and also the spur that goes towards Manchester?
Yeah, you know, unless I'm mistaken, I don't remember hearing much about the railroad as far as people input. Liesl, do you? And one thing I'll tell you too, virtually every community we work in, there's a railroad. You know, just because historically that's how towns developed and the railroad goes through town. And we've worked in places where it's a lot tougher, the impact that the railroad has. You know, I know it seems burdensome in a lot of ways, but Keith and Randy and I spent the last 3 days in Slidell, Louisiana, which is near New Orleans, and they've got this rail line along Front Street that cuts off their main city park from the balance of their Old Town area. And man, that's something, plus it's Amtrak and it flies through. So, you know, it is worth looking at to see what else can be done. But I will tell you, there are a lot of communities that have rail lines going through that are even more disruptive, believe it or not.
Just to tie that issue together, and in terms of linkages, because I think both of those questions have something to do with linkages with downtown. And whether you're crossing the railroad or coming down to here, for example, I think when you create or define your special districts, whether it's for a pilot program or TIF or for marketing purposes, for all of those purposes, then you can accommodate these areas within that district, and you can look at the infrastructure improvements, the marketing, the sites and buildings and how they are all redeveloped or rehabilitated in a way that's cohesive. So that's one thing you can do, is use those incentives and other programs to link them together.
Yeah, and just not to pile on, but I will. Also, when you get more development that occurs, that's a way to create linkages. When you have, I mean, sometimes it might seem like, gosh, do I really want to walk that 3-block distance? It's kind of desolate. It's not real interesting, even though there's sidewalks. But when you get infill development that has things like storefronts or interesting things, buildings that come up to the street, suddenly a distance to walk can seem a lot shorter. So that's another piece of it too, yeah. I think, oh, you got a question.
So that brought to mind just thinking about how some of the lots that we may have right now that are not being fully used and may be potential great development places for more special use things. Is there a way that in the zoning or your all's plan you could start to protect those so that they would be only available to certain types of development? For example, I don't think we need another gas station in maybe one of our areas that could eventually develop into, you know, more pedestrian type use or local business use. So car washes and things like that where you're going to have a lot of traffic. If we know that we've got these nice plots or maybe areas, can we start to reserve those?
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't really apply zoning that specifically to properties. You have to kind of treat areas with a lot of different, I mean, let's say for downtown, for example, you know, it's a mixed use area. Your zoning would reflect that, especially if our place types are implemented, although it pretty well does that anyway. And so you can't really just point to a spot unless you acquire it, you know, through zoning and say, oh, this has got to be, has to be one use or another. However, I will say we did review your zoning, and I think we had recommendations on maybe some uses that may not work as well as others, but that's really it on the zoning part. I think it has to be more of a city initiative. If you remember the one slide where I showed 3 new parking areas that could be downtown, and one of them was at the corner, I think we had it mislabeled. We had it correct on the map, but the text said something else, but it's really Wall and Grundy. There's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity along the railroad, along Atlantic, further north than where you have it. You could extend it there. Oh, and the other one was the current city lot that's on the south side of Lincoln that just needs improvement a lot to really be utilized, including, you know, the other thing that's really important about these parking lots is really good lighting. And, you know, if you want to have them used. So those were, you know, there are opportunities that we pinpointed for new parking lots, that is, in addition to managing your on-street parking a little better.
I realize that estimation of cost is an incredibly difficult thing to do at any point in time. I think the whole revitalizing sidewalks, new sidewalks, the pedestrian aspect of trying to make things more accessible is a really great idea. Right now, an ADA sidewalk is over $40 a linear foot. So you're talking about millions of dollars just in sidewalks. So do you have some type of global idea, if you started downtown, even something as simple as how expensive it would be to revitalize and build sidewalks?
Yeah, if you remember the slide I had that mentioned streetscape, in parentheses it said use sparingly. I'm not a big, streetscape can be effective, but it just depends when and where. I don't see that being a real high priority for your downtown. The main thing I pointed out was that when you do new streetscape, I think the model to use is the most recent improvements you've done that are like around the vicinity of Lincoln and Atlantic. In other words, use that. We did specifically say Jackson through the downtown. That ought to be redeveloped just because it's kind of tired and needs improvement. But we didn't really advocate that much on streetscape. But the other part of your question, until you do the engineering on it, you really can't do cost estimates, and that would be the next step with streetscape. It's also new development.
The plan for different new sidewalks and streetscape.
I don't know if you got into the details of this. Last year, one of the meetings, there was a discussion about, and this is kind of an unfortunate thing, but stratifying how much damage is done to your vehicle going across the tracks on this street versus that street versus that street, and how difficult it is to negotiate with the rail lines for support of those crossings. Cars getting beat up crossing those thresholds. Is that part of what's being recommended for the city to consider to negotiate?
I don't think we've addressed crossings in that regard. And I got to be honest, I don't remember that being a topic that was discussed, but did you? Okay, you did, okay.
That is in the realm, unfortunately, of the railroads. They are by law legally required to keep them up to a certain condition, but as you can see, it's maybe those regulations aren't quite strong enough. But it's certainly something worthy of the community to speak to, not just for vehicles, but when you think about folks in wheelchairs, for example, it's a challenge, certainly.
Add that the railroad crossings in town the contract has just been approved to improve most of them, if not all of them. So that will be happening pretty soon. So,
All because of our plan, I'm sure, right? I think down there. Well, that's good news. Yeah, it's good to hear. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, Greg Sandlin. I'm chairman of the Planning Commission in Tullahoma. And just a couple comments. I want to say, this is a good plan, but it's not city law. It's not city ordinance until it goes through the Planning Commission and then is approved by the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. And there'll be ample public comment opportunity in that process. So this isn't your only time to talk about it. It'll be far more detailed, piece by piece, as we make this plan process. And then secondly, I haven't followed this as closely as I should have, but I'm sure that there's aldermen in the room. But the city's getting $6 million of federal COVID relief money, and I think they've already decided how they're going to spend that. But I know at least 1.2 million was being set aside for some streetscape effort along North Jackson. So there's a lot of money, borrowed money from the feds, that's going to be there, and that Tullahoma does have a plan to spend that. So that's something that I'd like to hear from one of the aldermen or mayor how far along that is, though.
Jennifer Moody, City Administrator. So you're correct, Greg. It's $5.8 million in American Rescue Plan dollars. The Board of Mayor and Aldermen has adopted a spending plan, and unanimously, I would say, the top two priority projects, they've earmarked about $1.2 million for the North Jackson Streetscape Plan implementation, and that goes from Wilson Avenue on North Jackson, that intersection, to Hoover Lane, which is where Aldi and Stan McNabb are. and it will include portions of new sidewalk where missing connections are now. It'll include a lot of landscaping and some monument signage, cleaning up some of the kind of current clutter. We heard that a lot, that people want a more consistent look along that stretch of Jackson. And so that project's currently in design with our landscape architect. The second priority in that spending plan is stormwater. And so there are some identified specific projects, but for the most part, the first step we're going to take is a comprehensive look at citywide at what needs to be done that will benefit the entire city. And so out of that comprehensive plan for stormwater, we expect there will be some more specific projects that come out of it, and we'll be able to better prioritize how we spend the money after we have a plan in place. So yes, good point. I'm glad I was able to share that.
Great. Thank you. Anything else? Oh, there we go.
Yes, question. It seems like Tullahoma is fairly unique in that it's a small city, but we have really good internet. And it seems like an advantage we aren't really we could take advantage of, especially since a lot of people are working from home now, working from home, working all over the country from home, so they could be working for a company that's in LA or New York, whatever. Are there things the city could be doing to draw those people to the area, say, hey, you can live in this great environment, and we got high-speed internet so you can stay at the office, things like that? Or things we could be doing there?
Hey, Randy, you want to try that one?
Right, so I think that's part of the bigger strategy that we talked about before of technology development, where you're already a leader in that area. And so, linking those things together in terms of both the housing, the residential component of it, but also the job opportunities there, could be tied into that technology park development or into looking at those specific opportunities. And so when you have an economic development person in the city, they would be focused, for example, in that area along with some of the others.
Looks like that may be it. Oh, nope. You got good eyes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mary Samaniego. I'm your city planner. As far as the adoption of this plan, again, right now it's currently in draft form. It's working through the steering committee that was the members that were up on the slide that Phil presented. We anticipate it being completed through the steering committee hopefully by tomorrow. And then in a couple weeks, it's going to go through several work sessions at the Planning Commission, and then one public hearing at the Planning Commission, and then it'll be moved on to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. So we're hoping to get this plan finally adopted by July. So just to keep you informed as to kind of what the process is. And then once the plan is adopted, we'll immediately begin implementation. One other thing I wanted to add, just because it was brought up, part of the American Rescue Fund, one of the improvements for North Jackson is a pedestrian crossing in front of the high school. So it was my idea. It was in the plan already. That's it. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for coming out. This has been a very long process. It's taken over a year. We're not quite done, but I can see the finish line. And I want to thank everybody's input and time. So thank you.
When there is like a hearing about this, how is that? What is that format like? Will we have we all be able to speak and kind of give our opinions, have an opportunity to speak, and if so, how? Like, is there a time limit, like at the meetings?
Thank you. When it goes to the Planning Commission and when it goes to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, those are both going to be required public hearings, so all members of the public will be allowed to speak. Because of the magnitude of this project, I will increase the advertisement of when those public hearings. It won't be just a small legal ad on page 8 of the Tullahoma newspaper. We'll go make the extra effort to inform the public of the Planning Commission public hearings, to make sure everybody's voices are heard. There's going to be one Planning Commission meeting for the adoption. And we don't know what Planning Commission meeting that's going to go to because they haven't even done the work sessions to start the review yet. So it's pending as of today.
Planning Commission meets on the third Monday of the month at 4:30.
Right, that is true. But for the plan adoption, we might hold a special hearing, depending. We haven't gotten there yet. But we'll make sure that the public is informed for sure. Is that it? Going once? Going twice?
Sold. Thank you. Appreciate it.